we are celebrating the 55th anniversary of the Apollo 11 launch. But its greatest moment was probably when Neil Armstrong took his famous leap onto the surface of the moon. The live broadcast to millions of people around the world is one of the greatest moments of television, indeed 20th century history, and yet many millions today still believe it never happened. So on this episode, I want to know, was the moon landing a hoax? Welcome to America, a history podcast. I'm Liam Heffernan, and every week we answer a different question to understand the people, the places, and the events that make the USA what it is today. To discuss this, I'm joined by an investigative journalist and the author of One Giant Leap, the impossible mission that flew us to the moon, which I'll link to you in the show notes. Welcome to the show, Charles Fishman.
Thanks for having me on this wonderful American history podcast.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to have you join me for this. It's something that I've been really fascinated about, particularly, as the prospect of us going back up to the moon, maybe even Mars, sort of looms, in our lifetime. I think it was really important that we revisit what has been a really important moment in history that a lot of people seem to be still denying.
Well, let's do two things. First, let's put the Apollo moon missions in context, and let's put the phrase "a lot of people seem to be denying." The polling on Apollo in the United States has been pretty consistent. When you ask people, and they did this, we first landed on the moon in 1969, and the last moon landing, there were 6 total landings. The last landing was 1972, and I think the first poll that asked this question was in 1976. The most recent one I could find was in 2021. Did the United States land on the moon? 6% of Americans say, maybe not. It was a conspiracy. It was a hoax. 6%. So it's hard to get 70, 80, 90% of Americans to agree on the color of the sky at any given moment. Is the word "of" in United States of America capitalized? But in general, with the moon landings, the quote-unquote deniers or the quote-unquote hoaxers are a pretty small group. And going to the moon was the hardest thing that human beings have ever done outside of wartime. How do I know that? Well, NASA is really good at some things, not so good at other things. But one of the things NASA is really good is at keeping numbers, at keeping track of things, counting, literally counting. And my book about going to the moon, which I happen to have a copy of here, I don't know the thing I'm about to tell you. There's my book. My book is 466 pages. NASA has produced a book. That's the narrative of going to the moon. NASA has produced a book that is 360 pages, that is nothing but charts about going to the moon, called Apollo by the numbers. That's all that's in there. Every single question you could possibly ask that can be answered by a number. How much fuel did each rocket carry? How much fuel was used? What was the rate at which the fuel was used? Like anything you could answer. How much did each astronaut weigh when their Apollo rocket was launched? How much did they weigh when they came back? Pounds and kilograms. One of the things that NASA kept track of was how many people worked to discover, design, and build the equipment to send the astronauts to the moon and bring them back. Literally by the number of hours worked. And so what I did one day when I should have been writing my book was I added up the total number of human work hours, the total number of quote unquote man hours of work for Apollo, starting when President John Kennedy said, let's go to the moon in 1961, all the way through 1972. And the numbers are astonishing. The missions, the Apollo missions, the actual rockets, were in space for 2,500 hours. That's about 100 days total, right? 100 days would be 2,400 hours.
Mm-hmm.
For every hour of spaceflight, there was 1,000,000 hours of work
Wow.
on the ground. A typical human being will work about 200,000 hours in their whole life. So every hour of spaceflight required the entire working careers of 5 people. Imagine doing something for an hour, playing basketball, flying a spaceship, and at the end of that hour, the entire work lives of 5 people have been invested in your hour, and then the next hour comes along and the full careers of 5 more people. It was a level of intensity, of preparation, of work, 400,000 people working on the ground to send 3 people to the moon. So it was literally the hardest thing we've ever done. 400,000 people, more people working on Apollo than fighting in Vietnam. So it was truly this incredible, extraordinary undertaking. And frankly, there's a million ways of dismissing the conspiracy theorists, but in some ways the most heartfelt way of responding is how disrespectful that is to the work of the actual people around the world, in the United States, but in Australia, in the UK, all over the world, who made this possible. And they weren't astronauts. They weren't aircraft carrier pilots. They were just ordinary people, making it happen.
Yeah, and it's a valid point, and actually, yeah, it is very disrespectful to those who did work on it to say, "Oh, that didn't really happen." But it also kind of begs the question that if the conspiracy theories are true, or if just one of them is true, and the moon landing didn't happen, how on earth were so many people involved in making it happen allegedly, or faking it in this instance, able to be silenced and not let the cat out of the bag? It seems almost impossible to me that so many people didn't blab if it was fake.
Well, that's the whole point. There were 400,000 people working on the project, straight in, salaried, paycheck people. All those people had families. So suddenly you're at 4 per person, 1.5 million people who had mom or dad go to work every day. Were the 400,000 people in on the conspiracy, and they were doing work that didn't exist? Like I spent 4 years researching this. One of my favorite, there's so many little pieces of this that I love, but I don't even know. This often happened to me. I would go off somewhere and end up somewhere I wasn't expecting. But one of the things that Apollo laid the groundwork for a lot of technology that we rely on every day. One of those things was battery technology. I don't know about the people in your audience, but I'm old enough to remember that batteries weren't strong enough to power a drill, or to power a saw, or to power a lawnmower, or to power even a leaf blower, right? You had batteries for flashlights, but if you had a quote unquote electric drill, it was plugged into the wall, right? And in 1965, somebody at NASA said, we're going to need rock cores from the moon. We want to drill down. We don't want to just take what we can scrape off the surface. We want to drill 5 feet down and get what's down there, just to see what, even on Earth, if you go down 5 feet, that looks different than what's right on the surface. And we can't have cords strung from the spaceship with the door open all across the landing area. We need drills with batteries that are going to be strong enough to last 3 hours of rock drilling. They don't need to last 4 days. They don't need to power the spaceship, but they need to power the drill. And they went to a company that's a kind of iconic American company called Black & Decker, which is a tool company. And they said to Black & Decker, we need you to solve this problem. Of the literally 10,000 problems we've got in going to the moon, how do we get a rocket big enough to get us there? We need a battery for the rock drill that will sustain the rock drill. That's your job. And I went into the archives and I chased down the people at Black and Decker, and they did it. And the astronauts were able to use a rock drill that had a battery that did what it needed to do while they were on the moon. And there was no battery technology like that in 1969.
Mm.
And well, okay, if the whole thing was faked, somebody wrote the contract for Black and Decker. Somebody made that up. Somebody went through all the motions of figuring out we're going to have this problem, even though we're not actually going.
Yeah.
Then they bought the technology from Black and Decker, and what did they do with it? Throw it away?
Yeah.
I don't. You know what I mean? If it's an illusion, it's the best, most perfect conspiracy imaginable, right? And of course, it's not. It's not. And that technology was one of the things that made battery-operated power tools, which we all think of as sort of standard now, standard. It made it those developments cascaded right back out into the real world.
Yeah. And here's my biggest issue with all this conspiracy theory is, as you've kind of pointed out, the complexity in the fabrication that would need to have been like orchestrated to fake the moon landing. It kind of begs the question of why would they bother faking it when that seems almost as convoluted as just doing it?
Right. If you take the conspiracy theorists seriously, there was a famous Fox TV documentary way back in 2001. And you can literally just go to Wikipedia. You don't need to go far. Wikipedia has a great page that catalogs the top 15. It can't have happened because there's no stars in the pictures, right? Mm-hmm. That's the first and famous one, is that all the pictures taken on the moon show a black sky but we all know that if you're standing on the moon, you could see the stars even better. Therefore, they can't have gone to the moon, and they were smart enough to create the conspiracy, but not to put the stars in the background. But you can go through, and every one of those quote unquote "I gotcha" moments has been unpacked. But none of the conspiracy theories at all cope with what was actually happening on the ground in the United States to make this happen. And in fact, my book, One Giant Leap, is a little different than most going to the moon books, because I actually focused on not the astronauts, but the people who had to do the work to make the moon landings happen. And when you do that, it's not possible to conceive of anything but that this happened, because so many people were involved, and the technical and engineering challenges were so great. And so one of the biggest problems was that when John Kennedy said, let's go to the moon in May 1961, the smallest computers in the world were the size of 3 refrigerators that you would have in your kitchen in a row, side by side. That was a small computer. And you weren't sending 1 refrigerator to the moon, let alone 3. Weight, making things small, carrying only what you needed because of the capacity of the rockets was really important. And so between 1961 and 1969, really 1961 and 1967, MIT designed an all-new computer that was about the size of a roll-on suitcase, actually even a little smaller than a roll-on suitcase. And it was something like 100 times more powerful than the 3 refrigerators, and literally 1/10 the size. And the problem was that in 1967, 1968, 1969, we didn't have good memory technology. We have little disk drives now. We have flash drives. We can store stuff in a million different ways in something the size of your thumb. In 1967, 1968, all we had were tape drives, huge tape drives. And so in order to program the spaceship computers, and each Apollo mission had 2 identical computers, one for the main spaceship and one for the lunar lander, the lunar module that landed on the moon. And those two computers were identical, but they were programmed differently. The software was woven one wire at a time, and each wire was a 1 or a 0, as in software code. And so each wire, and there were 900,000, had to be in exactly the right position. And Raytheon built the computers that MIT designed, and they hired the best textile workers they could find in Waltham, Massachusetts, highly skilled textile workers, to do this weaving. So on the one hand, you had computers designed that, unlike anything that had ever been designed, by MIT engineers. And on the other hand, you had hourly wage workers, women who had just previously been making shirts and jeans, hired to do the same kind of weaving, actually even more precise, with wires for a computer. And those groups of people could not have been farther afield from each other, right? In terms of 1960s politics, education, understanding of what was going on.
Yeah.
They shared this unbelievable commitment to the mission, right? The women knew they could not get one wire wrong, like one wire wrong, and the software didn't do what it was supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
But that range of effort and investment and those kinds of people in 1960s America, 400,000 people working on something, it really was just like Vietnam. Everybody either knew somebody who worked on Apollo, or they knew somebody who knew somebody, right? Mm. You weren't very far removed. And it was kind of an insane effort. When you have to weave the computer software by hand, one wire at a time, each computer maxed out at 75K of memory. So if you get an email with headlines from your newspaper in the morning, that's more than 75K. And it took 6 weeks to weave the memory for one computer. So just a level of laboriousness and both manual labor and innovation at the same time, right? The most advanced computer, but we need these women who know how to make blue jeans over here to do it, because there's no other way of doing it right now.
Yeah, and I think you touched on a good point there about how, just as you mentioned, the technology that had to be invented. I mean, you mentioned batteries for one. In order to support the moon landing, its success, it's crazy really thinking about that now, because at the time, it really was at this intersection of not even analog and digital, but not even like non-existent technology. Like the idea of computers themselves were new and just not consumer facing at all. So yeah, the scale of that achievement is just mind-boggling to me, and that's why it really makes me think about the reasons why people might want to believe that it was all made up. And I think one of them, you have to consider the politics of the time, right? There was a space race. So would some people maybe think that actually America, maybe thinking that they might not win that space race, would simply make it up just to beat the Russians?
Well, look, let's take one step back even from there. In 1961, most Americans hadn't been on an airplane. Think about that. More than half the country had never taken an airplane flight, and their president was asking them to pay to go to the moon. So that's an incredible leap. They didn't have a sense of what flying was like, and we were being asked to fly, unimaginably far. And the point you make is a point I try and sort of make over and over again without becoming irritating in the book, which is when John Kennedy said, "Let's go to the moon" in May 1961, two things were true. It was an absolute act of political desperation. We'll get to that in a minute. On purpose. It was a purposeful act of desperation. And we had no idea how to go to the moon. The computers that were the size of refrigerators that needed to be shrunk, to the size of a briefcase, that was literally one of, as I said, 10,000 things. When he said, let's go to the moon, the US had 5 minutes of spaceflight experience. And one of the big arguments inside NASA in the summer of 1961, quietly, was whether your brain would work in space. What would zero gravity do to your ability to think? Now, I don't know. I'd never even thought about that. For me, it was impressive that they were really right down to the basics. Like, we don't literally know anything about what being in space is like. Maybe your brain won't work. Maybe you won't be able to think. In fact, we now have we've had people living on the International Space Station for going on 30 years. Being in space does a lot of bad things to your body, to your eyes, to your joints, to your bone density. Your brain appears to work, but we didn't know enough to know. And so on the first US missions, those Mercury missions, and even into Gemini, half the time the astronauts were up there, they were doing what they called cognitive tasks. Here's a chart, pick out the da-da-da-da, like we do on the internet sometimes. And can you do the multiplication tables? And here's a calculus problem. Can you do this differential equation? And if I read you a series of steps, can you remember them the way you remembered them back on Earth 2 weeks ago? Because if you were going to fly in space, you needed to know whether the astronauts could do what you were asking them to do. And so, as goofy as it sounds, they were actually committed to answering that question right up front. But the Soviet Union absolutely stomped all over the United States in the first 4 or 5 years of the space program. Famously, Sputnik, the first ever object launched into space, a satellite with a little beeping transmitter. It caused a panic in the United States. People went out and bought binoculars so they could watch Sputnik soaring overhead. TV stations and radio stations broadcast the beep, beep, beep so you could hear it. We were like, oh my God, what are they going to drop on our heads from up there? And then in short order, the Russians launched a dog. They launched 2 dogs. They launched dogs and brought them home safely. Just before President Kennedy said, let's go to the moon in April, a month earlier, the Russians, famously launched the first astronaut into space. And that astronaut did a whole orbit. 3 weeks later, we launched an astronaut and we just sent him up and back like a little softball, pop fly. We didn't even, we were, even when we were catching up, we were behind.
Yeah.
And this was in a context that it's a little hard for modern listeners who didn't live through the Cold War to understand. The rivalry between the United States of America and the Soviet Union was a little like the rivalry between the United States and China today, except magnified times 1,000. Every country in the world picked a side. You were either, quote unquote, aligned with the US or aligned with the Soviet Union. And then there was a small group that was characterized by the phrase non-aligned. And they tried to not be aligned with either one. And that was what the Korean War was about. And that was what the Vietnam War was about. Those were proxy battles. The United States and the Soviet Union famously had thousands of nuclear missiles aimed at each other so that if they decided there was no choice, they could obliterate their opponent in the blink of an eye. This wasn't like some silly soccer or football athletic rivalry. This was an existential rivalry for dominance in the world. And of course, from the US perspective, the battle between freedom and tyranny. The Soviets weren't granting anybody any freedom. And it looked like the Russians were using space to prove that tyranny was the superior system. We're crushing the great American freedom experiment with our brilliant technology. Look what we can do. They can't keep up. And they were certainly right about the results. And so President Kennedy was a young president. He'd only been president since January. And so he was very embarrassed by what was going on. And he literally said to his advisors and to his technical people, I want a space mission where we will undoubtedly beat the Russians. What's the mission? What can we do that where our obvious technical superiority will allow us to leap beyond them. And the answer was, we could say we're going to the moon. They'll never beat us to the moon. And so that's how they did it.
Do you think, though, that because of how the idea of going to the moon was conceived, and the fact that the possibility of it was just so unfathomable to ordinary Americans because of everything that needed to be invented to make it possible, and then subsequently the fact that television itself was such a new thing, and watching that on television seemed like such an impossible thing to be able to do. Does that not kind of fan some of the flames of skepticism that make people think it just can't have been possible?
I mean, I think exactly what you say is true. It was such a leap that creates the space for someone saying, how is this possible? And it was also taking place in the context of this political rivalry. It was a little subset story. It was a symbolic element of that rivalry, but a very high profile symbolic element. And so, sure, if you're asking, I mean, look, I don't think it's just Americans. The numbers outside the U.S. tend to be whatever. I saw some polling in the U.K., some polling in India that indicate, whatever, over the years, 20% of people say it didn't happen. I think people have a tendency to be skeptical. That's actually a good thing, right? Except when it comes to, like your health and your family and understanding how the world works. But also, it's hard for us to appreciate this. The 1960s were the dawn of technology. In 1959, the word technology, I actually did a fair amount of research on how people thought of the idea of technology. And in the 1950s in the US, we had this blossoming of quote unquote home technology. That was the era in the US when everybody got a dishwasher, everybody got what's called an automatic washing machine, one where you didn't have to crank a handle and shove your clothes through the rollers, a dryer, a blender. It was the dawn of the era of home appliances. And we might think of a fancy new blender or smoothie maker or something like that as technology now. But that word wasn't used. The word technology coming out of World War II and 1959 is closer to the end of World War II than we are to 9/11 now by far. Technology was military technology. Nuclear weapons were technology. A cool toaster was not technology. A neat, putting radios in cars, in the dashboards of cars, that was kind of an innovation. That wasn't technology. That was just cool. Mm-hmm. It was the dawn of the computer era that pulled literally the word technology into common use. And so people didn't understand how that stuff worked. And I think in some ways we were closer. Like, I think the typical American in 1960 probably understood his or her washing machine better than we do today, right? Because they were used to taking things apart and making them work. Yeah. But the phone system and computers and all that stuff, that was kind of gee whiz, like, I have no idea how this works. And mystery can create the space for doubt, right? Now, I would say, going in the other direction, Apollo 11, 1 million people stood on the beaches of Florida. 1 million people stood on the beaches of Florida and watched that rocket launch. So that obviously wasn't faked because there were 1 million people watching it.
Yeah.
So you really have to put aside the way the real world works to buy the conspiracy. Now, one of my favorite things to say is, how do we know there was an American Revolution? How do we know the United States beat Britain in a war in 1783? Like, if I go to the Battle of Yorktown, it just looks like a beautiful field and a shopping center now, right? So you have to rely on the way human beings work and storytelling and record keeping to believe anything except what happened yesterday in your own house.
Yeah. And I think this, okay. I mean, yeah, everything that you've said is just completely make sense, right? Like, how can a million people stand there and watch Apollo 11 take off, and people still believe that it's faked? And I think alongside perhaps the Kennedy assassination, there's few other conspiracy theories that I think have really gained the sort of traction that the moon landing has. So
Well,
why?
and that's because, look, the Kennedy assassination changed the shape of the world, right? And knock wood, there hasn't been a modern American president assassinated since Kennedy. And that was the first, Martin Luther King was killed, Robert Kennedy was killed, leaders of other nations have been assassinated, but that was an astonishing event. And one reason there's moon landing conspiracies is that the moon landing in some ways is arguably the greatest achievement of humankind, collective achievement of humankind to that moment, right? And so the first question it's reasonable to ask is, did it happen, and how did it happen? Did it really happen, right?
There's been a lot of scientific and technological and just huge breakthroughs in human history. We haven't questioned the legitimacy of anything else in the same vein as we have with the moon landing. So what is it that resonates so much with people about the idea that it didn't happen?
Well, I mean, you're right, but you use electricity every day, so electricity can't be if we count that as a breakthrough, electricity can't be a conspiracy.
Yeah.
Without disrespect, I'm guessing you don't know how microchips and semiconductors work, but we're using about 1,000 of them right now, you and I,
Yeah.
maybe 10,000.
Yeah.
And if they didn't work, nothing would work. Our cars wouldn't work, our computers wouldn't work, our headphones wouldn't work, our phones wouldn't work. So we didn't go to the moon. And the technology that was we do use Black & Decker's battery technology every day in every kind of appliance, but we don't wear spacesuits. We don't fly around in Saturn V rockets, right? So I would say that that going to the moon was an astonishing engineering achievement, an astonishing achievement of human organization. I mean, one of my favorite comparisons is in America, even more popular than saying it didn't happen is saying it did happen and it was a waste of money. Going to the moon total cost what fighting the Vietnam War cost in 1 year. And we fought the Vietnam War for 9 years. 1 year of the Vietnam War, and we paid for going to the moon. So at the same moment that we were engaged in this incredible project of competence and skill and breakthrough, we were the very same organization, the United States government, was running a parallel program that was a rolling disaster. A human disaster, a political disaster, a social disaster, year after year after year. So it is easy to get balled up in how could we have done that, and if we did that, then how did we succeed over here and fail over here? And you didn't even have to change ponies. Like the same guy, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, were in charge of both. And so you can use the internet every day. You use your email every day. How do I know I exist? I send an email to Liam, and Liam sends an email to me. If it's an illusion, it's a really damn good illusion. But I've never gotten in an Apollo spaceship and flown to the moon, or even anything close, or what I would think of as an ordinary person as close. And so that does create the space, for people to doubt. And if you look at the list, how come there aren't stars? That seems pretty obvious, man. The little pokes at the Apollo program that the conspiracy theorists latch onto are exactly the kinds of things that are easier to point out than to explain, right? You have to understand photography and shutter speed and exposure, how bright the moon was, how dim the stars are, to begin to understand why there's no stars in any pictures, taken on the moon. It has to do with photography, not with conspiracy.
Yeah.
But that explanation is 4 paragraphs long compared to the one sentence. They're so stupid. There's no stars in the pictures. How stupid do they think we are?
And I guess as well, people that want to believe that it's fake, the second that you start going into a long explanation as to why a certain thing is not valid, it's just going to be brushed off as an excuse. Oh, you're over explaining it. Well,
Right.
so I think people who want to believe it's fake will believe it's fake.
Right. My favorite failed effort to prove that we landed on the moon is that now India, China, Japan have landed on the moon themselves, not with people, but robotic probes, the Soviet Union, and the artifacts of our landings, all 6 landing sites, have been photographed from orbit, and the photographs have been sent back. So you can look at pictures of the Apollo 17 landing. You can see the dirt trails of the lunar rovers. And I just laugh and think, well, if you thought the original was faked, why wouldn't you think that the photographs of how hard would it be to fake? We sent an orbiter around. Look at the pictures it sent back. Oh, you got me now, right? Here's the best. I actually wrote an essay about this for the magazine I write for, Fast Company. Here's the best explanation. The politics got us into this, and the politics actually rescues us from the conspiracy theory. As I said, this wasn't some game between the United States and the Soviet Union. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people died in the tug of war to dominate the world. And the Soviets, in the end, we crushed them. They never sent human beings outside the orbit of the United States. They never even, forget landing, they didn't even send people to the moon and bring them back. They did send robotic probes in the end, but they never got a person, an astronaut, a cosmonaut, to even orbit the moon. But they monitored everything the United States did meticulously, and we did the same, including they had spy ships stationed just off Cape Kennedy, just outside U.S. waters, monitoring the launches, the technology, all the communications between the ground and the spaceship, as much as they could of what was going on in the spaceship. So much so that NASA protected Apollo radio technology and Apollo control technology. It was what's called hardened against interference from the Soviets. There was a worry that the stakes were so high that if they could screw up our navigation or screw up our radio controls or screw up commands from the ground to the engines or the gyroscopes or whatever, they would. And so the Soviets were there with their ships and their antennas and technology monitoring everything that we were doing. If we faked going to the moon, the Soviets would have revealed that with absolute glee. This didn't happen. It's just like all of capitalism and democracy. It's just a cardboard cutout. It's not real. And guess what? They never said that because it happened, right? Yeah. But I'll tell you who wasn't in on the conspiracy. The Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev was not in on the conspiracy.
Yeah, it's a very, very valid point. And I guess to sort of bring this far too brief a discussion to a close, we are at the cusp now where NASA have said, we're going to go back to the moon. And actually beyond that, we want a manned space flight to Mars. So the sort of space ambition of the US is as great as it ever was. Do you think that if that happens, we'll have the same set of conspiracy theories running around denying that it does?
Well, we've also got space powered by Elon Musk now, who is the creator and CEO of SpaceX, one of the most brilliant space companies in history, and also of Tesla. And Elon is himself an engineer who's brilliant, and also a guy who sometimes trades in conspiracy theories of his own. So I guess what I would say is most people have to live their lives. This is a famous issue in American politics. The people who follow politics closely in the U.S., and I suspect it's true in the U.K., almost can't imagine the degree to which ordinary people don't. They're living their lives. They're getting their kids to school. They're finishing their work assignments. They're making sure their bills are paid. They're thinking about how to spend the weekend or how to have a nice vacation. They're not really worried about who's going to get how many electoral votes and who's going to win Arizona and who's going to win Pennsylvania. And I think the same is true of stuff like this. Most modern technology at this point has taken a leap from 100 years ago. 100 years ago, a typical smart person could understand how a Model T worked or a steam engine worked or how your house was wired for electricity, how fuses worked, how toasters were different than washing machines. The pathways on modern computer chips are so small that you can't see them with light. The wavelengths of light are wider than the pathways on the chip. It is literally magical. And so if you hand a smart 24-year-old an iPhone who has no training in computer chip engineering or silicon engineering or software and say, how does this work? It's literally unimaginable how it works. You could look at the engine, the steam engine of a train and sort of say, oh, I get it. You know, you light the fire, the steam, the wheels turn. I can see all the connections. If you take apart an iPhone or you take apart a laptop computer or you take apart a TV, you just end up with a lot of parts sitting on the table with no idea. Nothing seems to be what it is, right? And so and I think that's okay, right? We all don't have time to understand how our iPhone works. It'd be nice if people knew the basics, but I don't think they really know the basics. Going to Mars, going back to the moon is completely different. You're not going to know how the rocket engine works, but you'll see you'll see whether the people actually get there and walk around and what that's like. And what I would say is space is very different than Earth. The consequences of getting one thing wrong. There's a famous moment in one of the Apollo missions where literally a piece of solder, a little metal piece of a electrical circuit broke loose and was floating around inside the control panel of the spaceship, and it kept bumping into the abort circuit, and the abort light would light up, and the people back in mission control were like, oh my God, are you pushing the abort button? What's going on? And it was just literally zero gravity and a little piece of metal debris. And so the consequences of making a mistake between here and the moon and here and Mars are just incredible. They're magnified 100 or 1,000 times compared to making a similar mistake with your bicycle or your car or your stroller with your kids, right? And so what I would say is going to the moon is still an absolutely monumental undertaking in many ways, just like it was. Going to Mars, despite what Elon Musk says about getting to Mars in the next 3 years or whatever, going to Mars is an order of magnitude harder. We don't know how to protect people from the radiation on the trip to Mars. We don't really know how to give them 3 months of water in a spaceship. It's a little like the computer the size of a refrigerator. To carry enough water to go to Mars and back, you need literally a whole separate spaceship just for the water. Most important, we don't really understand the human psychology of putting 5 or 6 high-performing people inside a spaceship for 3 months and saying, okay, now, it's really important that you get along because if you fight, you all might die. And so there's a lot that we don't understand about all that. But what's impressive to me is people want to make it happen. And there's some economics around it. You know, we went to the moon because we decided we were going to. Elon Musk isn't running a charity. SpaceX isn't a country. It's a business. He's trying to make money. And so what I would say is what's so impressive is the vision and the determination, the same thing that was impressive in the 1960s. Like, look at these people who won't take no for an answer. Isn't that cool? You know, it's like the guys who founded Google, who said, well, what if we just put all human knowledge on the internet? And guess what? Now, like, a lot of it is, but not if somebody hadn't said that. And it was crazy at the time. And this is the same thing. I don't think Elon Musk is crazy because he wants to go to the moon. He knows a lot more about going to the moon than I do. And you sort of have to be crazy to stretch that far and bring everybody with you. And so what I would say is, if I prefer to live in the world where we went to the moon, because that's the world of human striving and human achievement and the deep satisfaction of saying, I don't know how we're going to do that, but we're supposed to have it done by 1969, as opposed to the cynical world of, oh, just make it up. Everybody will believe you.
Absolutely. And that just about wraps up everything we have time for in this episode. So thank you so much to our guest, Charles Fishman, for joining me. And if you listening want to find out more, we've left some useful links in the show notes. So do check out those if you found this episode interesting. If anyone wants to connect with you, Charles, where can they do that?
You can put my email address in the show notes, and I'm, of course, on Twitter @CFishman. They can hit me up there. And if they want to argue, they can argue. I'm happy to hear it. And I'm delighted to have been on the American History Podcast. Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. And you can find me on X via This Is The Hef, and on LinkedIn, just search for Liam Heffernan because that's my name. And if you enjoy the podcast, please leave us a rating and a review wherever you're listening to this, and give us a follow so all future episodes appear in your feed. And additionally, we are now on Patreon. The link is in the show notes. So if you want to support the show, you can do that, and I'd be super, super grateful. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.